I was in Ukraine in May, and we had to see for ourselves what the hell is going on. And I can tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Ukrainian military not only is attacking civilians, but especially in the Donbass region, their military is led by Nazi forces, the Azov Battalion, IDARS, Vovota.
That was anti-war activist John Parker from the Socialist Unity Party, speaking at one of the dozens of anti-NATO, anti-war rallies and marches held across the U.S. over the King holiday weekend. Nearly 100 actions were posted at the website of the United National Anti-War Coalition, or UNAC, at unacpeace.org. The frantic organizing for peace in Ukraine comes almost 20 years to the day after millions poured into the streets on February 15, 2003, then demanding that the U.S. not make war on Iraq. It was the largest anti-war protest in the history of the world, with millions around the world joining in. Nevertheless, the U.S. began the war a month later, kicking it off with a massive bombing campaign that Washington dubbed Shock and Awe. Since then, the anti-war movement has appeared to be a ghost of its former self, despite intensive organizing against the wars on Libya and Syria during the Obama administration. The war in Ukraine, however, threatens to become a much larger war, one that could well end up being fought not just over there, but over here as well, and with nuclear weapons. To try to gain an understanding of what those in the anti-war movement are thinking, we spoke with two members of UNAC's national board, both longtime anti-war activists, Sara Flounders of the International Action Center and Margaret Kimberley of the Black Alliance for Peace. This was Sara Flounders.
No one is really for this war. They've been silenced, yes. And the role of the media is always to marginalize, make it seem insignificant, irrelevant to their war plans. Their role is to marginalize the deep opposition to this war.
Yeah.
They want to project an image that they are all powerful. And actually, what in fact has happened is that they have utterly failed in this war to bring down Russia, which they announced they would do in short order, in days and weeks, that the Russian economy would collapse. And instead, what has happened is it's had a disastrous impact on the European Union. Now, that's also to the U.S. benefit. They wanted to break. German trade with Russia was 10 times German trade with the U.S. They've succeeded in breaking that. Now, the people throughout Europe will pay a terrible price for this war. But the war profiteers are making out better than they even did on Iraq or Afghanistan. So they are 110% for this war. The most important thing we got to do is to continue to organize and mobilize. Now, from UNAC, that's United National Anti-War Coalition, we called for coordinated local actions on the Martin Luther King week. We are now up to, there's 86 different events we've listed as of today. Now, that's not in the millions, no, but that means in cities, towns, areas across the country, there are people organizing, planning events, building local coalitions. That's important. They're combining it, working with others. Our demands were actually much stronger. There were those who mobilized, who simply called for peace in Ukraine or no to NATO expansion, and much milder slogans. Actually, UNAC went right out with no to NATO and stop U.S. wars, and linked the war in Ukraine, the war against Russia, to the very dangerous and growing threats against China, but also the continuing sanctions now against a third of the world's population, the war on Palestine, bringing in the difficult issues, continuing war against Afghanistan, starving a whole country down, the blockade of Cuba. Let's talk about it. They're unending. And you got to put it in perspective if you're going to talk about Ukraine, because the U.S., through NATO, planned, orchestrated, organized, mobilized, equipped this war and did so with constant missile attacks right on the Russian border against the Russian population of Ukraine. They did everything they could to instigate this war because wars are profitable for them and wars are their way of asserting their global dominance. And it's important that they have so utterly failed. The entire global South, all of Africa, Latin America, most of Asia, has refused to go along with the U.S. demanded sanctions. The European Union countries, Britain, they all dutifully passed hundreds and hundreds of pieces of legislation, and it has, as I say, impacted their economy disastrously. Ukraine is being used as a complete pawn. There's not a thought, a care, a concern for what's happening to the people of Ukraine, who didn't plan for this war and actually voted for what they thought was an anti-war candidate, a peace candidate.
Right, that's right.
Who's just a pawn of the U.S. completely. So I think we want to refuse to be demoralized. That's what they want from us. They want to silence us. They want to say nothing gets decided. The U.S. decides everything. And the whole world is saying no. Just by refusing to go along with the sanctions. What a statement. They thought the dollar was all powerful. And now even oil is beginning to be traded in the yuan, the ruble, different currencies that never were thought of before as having international exchange. And now they are.
Yeah.
So we want to look at these changes that are happening because U.S. hegemony, U.S. dominance is being severely challenged. This is not the end of the U.S. empire, but it is the end of them being able to call all the shots and just expect everyone to salute. And we are seeing a real frazzling, a fragmenting of NATO. We're seeing the impact it's having on the economy right here. And this will create a stronger and stronger movement. So the fact that there's 86 different cities, and we did this again in October, coordinated actions, and we were thrilled. I think there were 71 different actions. So it's growing. We're hearing actually still this week for more because it was January. We set the dates of January 13th to the 23rd, the Martin Luther King weekend. It's actually week. It gives a couple of weekends in there for all different activities coming up. We took part in the action here in New York City, but there were 5 different events in New York, each of them challenging the U.S. war. And the very support for these demands put forth by UNAC of no to NATO and no to U.S. NATO wars, very important. And I think it's emboldened people in a very good way.
Thank you very much. Margaret Kimberley is also a board member of UNAC, and she gave us her perspective. We have, this big war machine cranking up and ready to go, and a very slow starting opposition. What kind of advice do you have for people about what we should be working on to try to stop this?
Well, I think the advice is the same. We should be, all of us should join organizations. We should take part in actions. We should write letters to our editors, write to our members of Congress to stop the war in the proxy war, the U.S. instigated proxy war in Ukraine, and to always talk about military spending and U.S. interference abroad. We just have to keep doing what we're doing. It's unfortunate that we have to, but we do have to acknowledge we have to work hard with elected officials. This war making is becoming more and more bipartisan. It's unfortunate that even those who claim to be progressive when it comes to issues of war, they go, as they do with other issues, right? At the end of the day, they go right down the line. But it's up to us. It's up to us to have these movements. It's always the people who drive these things. So while we should lobby as well as we can or write a letter to the editor, we have to be out in the streets. People have to see us. And, that's another thing. If people think they're alone, if they think nobody else agrees with them, if they think nobody else cares that $100 billion of our money is going to the military industrial complex to use in Ukraine, where it's ultimately going to be blown up by Russia anyway. If people think that no one else is concerned, but them, then that's it generates apathy and defeatism, and that's not what we want to do. So, in short, we've got to do what we've always done.
So, they're ready. I mean, they've been delivering weapons into Ukraine for 8 years at least, and they've been fighting a war now since February. I remember we had millions of people in the street in February of 2003. Maybe it stopped the war with Iran down the road, but it didn't stop the war with Iraq. And then we had what happened with Libya. I remember UNAC was the only group, really, UNAC Answer and related groups, and the only people working on Libya. And we had the rally in Union Square. It was very well attended. There wasn't much else that happened. And that war, of course, there was no resistance to here, that effective resistance, because they destroyed Libya. We're starting even further behind the 8 ball now. I mean, after years of apathy and just, I don't know, defeatism, I think is a very good word for the way people have felt and behaved. And they've got their machine cranked up like it hasn't been since World War II. What should people be doing individually just to kind of grow this thing really fast?
Well, I think speed is of the essence. We have one of the problems with Libya is having democratic presidents. We found out later that, and I cannot believe it's 20 years ago, but at any rate, it was 20 years ago, that hundreds of thousands of people protested against the war in Iraq. But it turned out that was largely an anti-Bush response, more so than it was anti-war. And of course, they just presented Obama and marketed him as an anti-war candidate when he was nothing of the kind. He even said so himself. I'm not against all wars, just dumb wars. So
Nobel Peace Prize, though. He even had that.
Oh, Jesus. Look, that's a whole other story, right?
Right.
So, but that's why the U.S. uses proxies. They know that people are most concerned about U.S. troops being sent somewhere. And that's why they use proxies in Libya or Syria or Ukraine or any number of other places. But, one of the things we have to do to mobilize people is to talk about how it's connected with other issues. There are all over the country. They say I've seen the figure of 500,000 unhoused people. I'm sure it's 1 million. I'm certain that's an undercount. But nobody talks about giving people housing, and it's not complicated. You have to build housing, and that means the federal government. Biden hasn't given one speech about the plight of the unhoused, who are growing because guess what? How can you afford housing if the minimum wage doesn't go up for decades? So I think we also have to make those connections with other folks, people who are active on other issues, because people see the connections. That's why there's so much propaganda. That's why they had that love fest for Zelensky in Congress. That's to try to silence people. But I think a lot of things are going to come to a head, and that is a good thing, to have a crisis. But we have to be there to provide the answers. You have to read blackagendareport.com every week. Black Alliance for Peace is doing a lot of work. Black-led organization, blackallianceforpeace.com for anybody who wants information. And we have to dedicate ourselves to fighting against these people, because at the end of the day, we really do not have a choice.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
For KPFK, I'm Don DeBar.